Okay, so for this unit, we're going to be talking about the issues raised by, debates about drug decriminalization, drug legalization, reforms to drug laws, as well as issues that might be raised by addiction or drug use. Should we change drug laws? How should we change them? One question I want to be very precise about, one thing I want you guys to get from this unit is, even if we think there should be some changes to drug laws, it's not an either or question. Should we keep them the same or should we legalize them? You know, it might be the case that we should make some big changes to drug laws. And, I'll tip my cards a bit. I honestly think we should. But it's still an open question. What do we do from there, right? You know, there are a lot of different things that get bandied about. You'll hear people talk about decriminalization, reform, legalization. People mean different things by all those terms, and I think it's very important that we be clear what people mean by those terms. One of the things philosophers are big on is be clear what you mean by this, right? And I think this is definitely important here because if we're not, we might talk past each other. So, anyway, one of the first things I'll do today when we talk about Boaz on drug legalization, let's just be clear what Boaz is arguing for. But before we do that, I think it is worth saying a word. Well, why do we, talk about this issue of drug legalization and the issues raised by drug use? Well, for one thing, it is an important social issue. It is one we're debating. It is one that affects a lot of people's lives in a very real way. So that's a good reason to include it in the course. But another reason is that it raises and illustrates some interesting issues about rights and also some general philosophical questions that are going to be important as we go through the course. Well, is there a right to drug use? Well, we have a right to our own bodies. Does that mean we have a right to put drugs into them, right? Boaz will, just to give you guys a heads up, Boaz will say yes. I'm going to be a little more skeptical about that, right? And we'll also see in Boaz's argument, an illustration of, Dworkin says we argue about public policy in different ways. We might have utilitarian considerations. On the other hand, in other areas, we have this talk of rights. We see both at work in Boaz, so I think it's a nice illustration of that. And also, as we get to the end of the unit and start talking about, drug addiction and what allowances, if any, we as a society should make for drug addicts, we'll get into these issues of freedom and personal responsibility that will be hugely important when we talk about debates about who should get what, the rich in society owe the poor, all this stuff that we'll talk about, under the heading of distributive justice in a few weeks or a month or so. So all that will get raised here. Questions about drugs are really interesting in and of themselves. They also bring up some interesting and important philosophical issues that will be, we will be talking about throughout the course. Okay, so that's a really wide sort of view. Let's zoom in a bit more and talk about Boaz's specific arguments on drug legalization. So look, as I said, when we talk about debates about drug laws and possible changes to drug laws, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. Boaz takes a very radical position. When Boaz talks about drug legalization, he means just that. Doesn't mean, oh, marijuana should be legal or, oh, we should lessen penalties for drugs. Boaz thinks all drugs should be legal. There should be no legal restrictions on what drugs people can buy, sell, or use. If you lived in Boaz land, then, if you wanted heroin, you could go down to the corner store and buy heroin, assuming the store sold it, right? I'm going to guess not every store would want to sell heroin, even if they were allowed to. But if 7-Eleven wanted to sell heroin in Boaz world, you could go down to the 7-Eleven and get some heroin. Cocaine, LSD, any of that. People want to sell it, they should be allowed to sell it. You want to buy it, you should be allowed to buy it. Full on legalization of all drugs. So just be very clear on that as we're thinking about Boaz, as we're discussing him. I've had students in the past say, well, I agree with Boaz. Marijuana should be legal, but all this other stuff should be illegal, right? If you think any drugs should be illegal, you do not agree with Boaz, at least not entirely, right? Boaz, everything legal, no restrictions. If Boaz were in charge, I'm betting you wouldn't even have to say, show your ID and sign for your heroin, right? I don't know, maybe you'd have to show your ID to show you're over 18 or whatever. But in Boaz world, it would be easier to buy heroin or cocaine or any drug you can think of than it currently is to buy Sudafed, right? If you guys haven't had to do this, I have horrible allergies. Not running a meth lab, I do have really nasty allergies. At least once a year, March, April, I'll have to go buy some Sudafed, and it literally, I don't know, I've had some jobs I've been hired for where you have to jump through less hoops to get the job than you do to get a box of Sudafed in the state of Virginia. In Boaz world, we wouldn't have that. We also wouldn't have, any laws or any restrictions like that if you wanted to get we're worried about people making their Sudafed into meth. In Boaz world, you would just be able to go buy your meth from the grocery store or wherever, the drugstore, if they wanted to sell it. So be clear how radical what Boaz is proposing is. If you agree with him, then fine, but just be clear what you're agreeing with. Well, now look, as I said in the in the lectures on argument, if you're going for a radical conclusion, you need really strong premises in support of it. So what are Boaz's arguments? What are his premises for this really radical conclusion? Well, Boaz actually has 3 lines of argument. Boaz is a lawyer. Lawyers often for their positions will make different arguments that might not be closely related to each other. Philosophers get a bit snotty about this sometimes. They might describe arguments like Boaz's as, well, let's just throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and hope some of it sticks, right? But I do think it's interesting that he gives these 3 different lines of argument because they're pretty thorough. They get at a lot of what's important about the drug debate and about, our so-called war on drugs. So Boaz's 3 arguments for drug legalization, full-on legalization, are these. Drug laws don't work. They don't stop people from using. We make drugs illegal, but that doesn't do anything to cut use. Making drugs illegal, having drug laws, Boaz would say, is just a waste of time and resources. 2, drug laws in various ways do more harm than good. Boaz will say they also lead to violations of other basic rights. Now, we'll talk about what he thinks those bad effects are and what rights are violated because of having drugs illegal. But Boaz will say, well, look, there are all these bad effects from the war on drugs, making drugs illegal, get rid of that, we'll avoid that stuff. Finally, number 3, Boaz will say, in and of themselves, drug laws violate a basic right. We have a right to do what we want with our own bodies. We have a right to put what we want in our own bodies. That comes from that right to do what we want with our own bodies. Now, one thing I want you guys to be clear on is that these arguments are independent of each other. You might be convinced by one, drug laws just don't work, and not by 2 or 3, but that would be independently a reason to get rid of drug laws or reform them, right? Or you might not be convinced by 1 or 2. You might think, well, drug laws could prevent some drug use. You might think, well, they don't really do all the harm Boaz says, but we have this basic right. He's right about that. That would be enough to get rid of drug laws, or so Boaz thinks, right? So these arguments are independent of each other, and we might think some of them are bad arguments, but even if one works, it might be enough that we would have to legalize drugs, or at least change drug laws quite a bit. Now look, I think it's interesting to see what kind of arguments these are. We are going to dig in a lot more detail in each of these 3 lines of argument. There will be presentations devoted to each of these. So we're going to go in a lot more detail. But I think before we do that, it's worth seeing what kinds of arguments these are. So I've color-coded this here. The drug laws don't work argument is a purely utilitarian argument. This just makes reference to consequences. If drug laws don't work, if they don't prevent use, then they're just a waste of social resources. We should get rid of them because it's just basically like throwing money on a fire, right? We could use those resources elsewhere in ways that would create more happiness. We could use them, liberals would say, on other social programs. Boaz is a libertarian, very much on the right as far as economic issues go. Boaz could say, well, we could use that money to give me, David Boaz, and some other people tax cuts, right? Which would make them happy. Point is, if drug laws don't work, we can do something else with that money, whether it's social programs or tax cuts or whatever, or even just filling in potholes in the road, that will create happiness elsewhere. Argument 2 is interesting because it's partially utilitarian, but here we get into the realm of rights. Boaz will say drug laws do more harm than good. He thinks that a lot of the violence around selling drugs is due to drug laws. Not due to just, addicts or dealers being violent people, due to the fact they're illegal. That might sound bizarre to you, but I actually think he has a pretty good argument for this, and we'll talk about it in a few lectures. Well, that's a utilitarian argument, right? Drug laws have these bad effects, they create violence. But Boaz will say because we have drug laws in place to try to enforce drug laws, we end up as a society violating other rights, right? We search people in cases where they shouldn't be searched. We break into people's homes and, we do that way too easily and quickly because we want to look for drugs, right? So part of this is a utilitarian argument, just has some bad effects. But if drug laws lead to violations of other basic rights, we start to get into an argument that's also rights-based, right? So 2, tried to do this, I don't know if the color works, 1 is blue, 3 is red, 2 is a nice little, lilac-y blend of light blue and light red, right? Anyway, my point is, here he is using both utilitarian considerations, but also rights-based considerations. Finally, argument 3 is an entirely rights-based argument. In and of themselves, drug laws violate a basic right, a basic moral right to do what we want with our own bodies. And the point here is, even if we were to think 1 and 2 fail, 3, if Boaz is right, would be enough reason, right? Even if he thinks there are very good utilitarian reasons to get rid of drug laws. But even if he's wrong about that, if he can prove 3, well, remember, as Dworkin said, rights trumps utility. Even if Boaz were wrong about 1 or 2, even if it turns out that drug laws created more happiness than not having them, if we do have this fundamental right, that would trump these considerations of utility. That would mean we have to legalize drugs. Anyway, so I think this is interesting because you can already see, sometimes we make public policy and laws on utilitarian considerations. We also, rights come into the picture. You see both at work here in Boaz's discussion of drug laws. On utilitarian grounds, we ought to get rid of them, he will say, but also even if there aren't good utilitarian grounds, they violate rights. That's a reason to get rid of them as well. So, keep these lines of argument distinct. Don't blur them together. Boaz is a little sloppy on this himself, but I think it's important that we sort them out. Anyway, next lecture and the lectures after it, I'm going to go through each of these arguments in a bit more detail, see if we really do think they are good arguments.